Well, welcome everybody to our webinar today on standards of practice, risk management, and closing the loop techniques in real estate transactions. I'm Jeff Wyron with Premier Property Group, LLC. I'm here with Richard Kaplan with Windermere Stellar. This is a unique opportunity for all of you to have two past chairs of the OREF Forms Committee talking about standards of care in the real estate industry. So I'm here at the request of Phil Queren, who was originally scheduled to do the conference or the webinar today but not available. So here I am. So I'm going to start us off, and we're going to talk about standard of care and try and put some flesh to how to define that, and then who determines it, and just some details about it. And I would say that as we go right into it, when you start talking about a standard of care and how you define it, is it defined by today's best practices? And are those aspirational, or are those real and tangible? And who determines it, right? So I think those are all kind of self-answering questions from the standpoint of the industry, the real estate agency, statutes and administrative rules, and then the forms that we have in use. I look at standard of care as we have standards of practice in the Code of Ethics, the NAR Code of Ethics that we all subscribe to as realtors. There are certainly guidelines and rules through the Oregon Real Estate Agency that we should all be aware of and following. In addition to that, the OR Real Estate Agency imposes sanctions for people who don't do things properly, right? So we have some feedback there that we can follow and use as a guideline for what's a minimum standard of care. And I think most importantly is the day-to-day actions and operations of the people out that are practicing and selling through the forms that they use. And I think the forms do help us set a precedent and create a standard of care. And I think that that is an integral part of what we do and how we do it. So does NAR determine? Well, as I mentioned, the Code of Ethics comes with a standard of practice. I just got done teaching the Code of Ethics class. So every section of the code has several standards of practice, right? You can only be in violation of a code and not a standard of practice, but the standard of practice is what's used to determine whether or not you're violating the code, right? And in many cases. So I think that NAR does certainly participate in helping us determine what a standard of care is for our industry through those standards of practice, which in my opinion are much more than aspirational. One of the things that I would posit and say, and I've said to the brokers at my company for many years, is that I think on an annual basis at minimum, you as a broker in the industry should be looking at the NAR Code of Ethics. You should take a review of it. You can easily Google ORS 696 and the associated guidelines and rules that we have to follow. And review those on an annual basis. In addition to that, I think you should be looking at the MLS rules and regulations for whatever MLS you subscribe to and make sure that you understand what those rules are. I think those three documents give you a really good fundamental of understanding what your roles and responsibilities are in this industry to your client and to yourself. And I think if you do that on an annual basis, you'll be more educated than the average broker for sure, but it gives you a good basis of what is my minimum here? What am I really obligated to do in representation of a client? And I believe that aspirationally, you want to do more than that, right? You want to serve your client well. The reason you're in this business is because for most of us, we enjoy providing service to our clients. We like being of value. And so it's not just a risk management, it's more than that. It's how can I make sure that my client is properly represented and taken care of, and that they have a good transaction, and those standards of care and standards of practice are all a part of that. Do you agree, Richard? Do you mind if I lean on you a little bit here?
Yes, and then we would also refer the licensees, because their individual brokerages may have additional standards of care that
Sure.
they need to be sure that they are following those rules and guidelines that are provided by their managing broker company.
Yeah, good point. A lot of brokerages have their own disclosure documentation, for example, that they ask their brokers to complete as part of a transaction. Most brokerages, all of them should, but some of them may not, have policy manuals with rules that they expect their brokers to follow and professionalism guidelines and things like that. So that's a very good point as well. Okay, so then what happens if the standard of care is not met? And generally, lawyers will use expert testimony to establish a standard of care and argue it if it isn't met. And if the broker has committed a form of malpractice, such the same as if a doctor or lawyer has failed to meet what the industry agreed to as their standard of practice, standard of care. So ORS 31.350 is that guideline, and that governs kind of what expert testimony how that can play a role in determining a standard of care. Certainly, as you all know, I'm not an attorney, so I'm filling in for Phil Queren, who is an attorney, and he could speak probably better to ORS 31.350. But what I can tell you is I have seen brokers participate in being expert witnesses, quote unquote, in cases where there's either some type of a dispute or an issue and trying to determine whether a broker really did meet the minimum standard of care for their client. There are some rules that fall into that, but that is one of the things that happens if a standard of care is not met. There's some research and some testimony and an opportunity for the industry to respond through experts in the industry. Okay, and then the next question is kind of a definition of risk management. Is that the same thing as evaluating legal exposure, and how does that fold itself into a standard of care? I look at it from my company's perspective as the managing broker at my company. When we're talking about risk and risk management, we're always thinking about the legal exposure that the company may have and the broker may have, right? As I stated before, I think that while that is a primary concern for all brokerages, just because of how our industry is, it also serves as a secondary concern. And I say that in this way. If you're putting your client's interests first, if you genuinely have your client's interests at the forefront of your interaction in the transaction, that is the baseline, in my opinion, for the best risk management you can have, right? It is the broker who puts their commission check in line in front of the interests of their client that's going to get into trouble and will likely not be a standard of care in a transaction. So when we talk about risk management and legal exposure and standard of care, I believe that while they're all a primary concern, at the very forefront of that is, as I've stated, your genuine willingness and ability to put your client's interests first above your own. That's your agency relationship. That's your fiduciary duty. And that's what you want to do as a service provider in this industry. And if you do that, not to say that you can't make a mistake, not to say that things won't happen in a transaction that may cause some legal exposure or risk, but at least you'll be able to come back to and say, my motivation here was to do the right thing for my client in this transaction. That was why I took the actions that I took. Okay? So, and it applies to you as the broker, your company, and obviously your client, potentially the other side. If there's risk in a transaction or if there's a problem in a transaction, that applies usually to all sides of the transaction. And Phil has a comment here on my notes that he gave to me that historically when a claim is made against a client, the broker isn't far behind. And I know we've seen that. I'm sure probably, Richard, you've seen that too. That if there is a dispute in a transaction, unless it's clearly a case that it's a dispute over a property condition item that's clearly between the buyer and the seller, it's very common for the broker and the brokerage to be named in whatever dispute or claim.
Exactly, and so dispute between buyer and seller, buyer doesn't get as much as they want, seller's upset they had to contribute something, often both sides then go to their prospective brokers and say, you didn't provide a standard of care that would have prevented this loss of something. And so that's why the standard of care is so important.
Yeah. And one of the side points to that I would say, and we deal with a lot, is after the closing of the transaction, your ability to manage that and help your client with that becomes very limited, right? You're not attorneys. And so if there is a dispute that arises after the deal has closed, the best thing you can do, and really I think oftentimes the only thing you can do, is refer your client to the dispute resolution section of the sale agreement and give them a referral to a good, competent attorney to help them figure out what they need to do to resolve their dispute, right? That's how that goes. Commonly, I see agents, even a year, 2 years after the transaction, they'll get an email or a phone call from a cooperating broker saying, hey, there's an issue, can we deal with this, or can we participate in this, or what can we do about this? And I think all you can do at that point is relay the information to the principal in the transaction and let them know of the concern and give them an opportunity to respond directly to the other party in the transaction regarding that concern. Yeah. But you certainly shouldn't put yourself in the middle of it at that point.
We aren't authorized to negotiate anymore once it closes.
Correct. Right.
We have no authority to represent whatever client we had in the transaction.
Right. And so facilitation of the communication is about the limit, I think, of what you can do after closing. And I will say that that's one of those so important reasons that you should always work to make sure that and you're going to talk more about this, but that you close those loops prior to closing, right? We have documents that can be used for that purpose, and so many ways that you as a broker can try and make sure that prior to the closing of the transaction, that everything is done, that there is a limited risk of something cropping up after closing that hasn't been fully vetted during the process of selling that property. Okay, so let's talk about, Phil has on here defining management, right? So identifying and controlling and policies and procedures. Most of you, there are many of you that may have your own brokerage and your own principal broker. You may have a few brokers with you, you may not, but a lot of us work for large companies, and so your real estate activity is being supervised by a broker, by a principal broker, and that principal broker will have policies and procedures and will have some control over your transactions. You need to keep in mind that there's a reason for the timeline that the agency has set for you to submit documents to your broker. It's 3 days from the date of your client's signature that it needs to be submitted, and it needs to be reviewed by your principal within 7 days of your client's signature. So part of the reason for that is that your principal broker has an opportunity to make sure that you're transacting business according to their policies and procedures, and that you're protecting your client, that you're not doing something, and to give the benefit of the doubt, unintentionally. Right? You just maybe written something the wrong way, or you're a newer broker and you don't understand the form, so you used it in the wrong application or something. Your principal broker needs to have the opportunity to help you correct that earlier in the transaction than later, and they have to have an opportunity to supervise that. So I'm sure that no one on this conference call has ever been in a situation where they may have turned in a transaction late or submitted documentation after closing on a deal that their principal broker has never seen. But I do know it happens from time to time out there. And you have to know that your management in your company is not going to look favorably at that, right? I mean, I know in our company we're very strict on paperwork and guidelines for turning in, and we strive for compliance with the agency and what we do. And the reason is we want to be able to know that what you're doing with your client, A, is proper and appropriate, and that you're following our policies and how we want you to be taking care of that client and serving the public. And, as an independent contractor with your brokerage, it's your brokerage's decision whether they want to accept the level of risk that you're putting them into. So there are certain high-risk transaction types, right? For example, dual agency, where you might be representing both sides in the transaction. while that's legal in the state of Oregon, it certainly is more risky. You're representing both sides of the transaction. You have exposure on both sides of the transaction. You know, while that's legal, there are some companies, I think, that don't allow it. I know our company personally does, but we encourage against it. And I think that's probably the policy that most companies have, is that while they allow it, they discourage it.
And they may have certain restrictions on it. I'm a agent and I work with a family member who's a builder. It wouldn't be appropriate for me to represent a buyer in some company policies because there's my allegiance. How can I provide my allegiance to a buyer when I'm related to the principal on the other side?
Yeah, I agree with that, and I think there's some of those circumstances that you'll find where the conflict of interest is just too great for it to be explained away, right? You can't honestly look at a buyer and say, you know, it's my house, I'm representing myself, I'm also going to represent you, and I'm going to put your interest in the transaction equally to mine when I'm the seller of the property, or my dad, or my brother, or whatever it is. Absolutely, I think that there's some concern there. You know, another point that comes up in high-risk transaction is multiple offers. You know, you might have one or more unhappy buyers in a multiple offer circumstance, so clearly documenting how those offers were presented, making sure that all parties were treated fairly and that every negotiation was done in good faith. And I see this on the opposite side with agents representing buyers, making multiple offers on properties where the buyer can only purchase one of those properties, but they make 5 offers, knowing that they might have to revoke 4 times or whatever. And obviously that's unethical practice, and there are ways to do that, but the seller has a right to be notified of that circumstance. So, you know, those are some examples of high-risk transactions. I would also say, and you're going to talk more about this with the forms, but depending upon how you draft the form, you create a high-risk transaction by the improper use of a form or not using the right form. So, for example, I believe that condominium sales and townhome sales where there's a homeowners association are a much higher risk transaction than a single-family detached residence sale is, especially if you don't give the buyer a contingency time period to review the documents and have an opportunity to fully vet the homeowners association that they're becoming a member of, and that you don't make sure that they get all the documents that are requested. Not that you as the broker are going to take the responsibility of review of those documents, but you do have an obligation to make sure that your buyer, if you're representing the buyer, receives the documents that were requested and has had a chance to review them, and that you note to the buyer if there are documents that they've requested that they don't receive. And we in our company have started using the receipt of reports removal of contingency, OREF 059, which you may talk more about later. But I think in the absence of using the proper documentation to start a condominium sale or a townhouse or a property that's in an HOA and not using that addendum, I believe you turn that into a high-risk transaction. And even more so if you don't use that OREF 059 and have the buyer remove the contingency. Verify that they've received the information and that they are willingly removing the contingency prior to closing. So, you know, that becomes a standard of care when we start doing that. You know, the more companies do that, the more brokers do that. I believe that now becomes a standard of care. It elevates it to that level. So another point here on policies and procedures are that written policies and procedures certainly insulate the managing principal broker in the company. But along with having the written policies and procedures, you have to be able to show that you don't condone the misconduct or that you're not ignoring the misconduct. So, for example, you know, we have a paperwork policy at our company. And, you know, if we regularly have a broker who's not turning in their paperwork in a timely fashion and we're not able to review it in a timely fashion and maintain compliancy with a real estate agency, we will find that broker and we will ultimately make a decision to not continue working with that broker instead of just putting in the file, hey, this was late, and 10 deals later, they're still turning in late paperwork, and you as the broker are continually notifying them that they're turning in late paperwork, but you're not acting on that at all other than the notification. I don't know that that's real proper supervision, in my opinion. So anyway, those written policies and procedures, while I think, you know, they do insulate the managing principal broker, you have to also know that it's not acceptable just because you've got it stated that I told them not to turn it in late and it's in our policy manual that they're supposed to turn their paperwork on time. If you regularly get late paperwork from that broker and take no action, you've condoned the activity. Do you agree with that?
Yes. And so when a real estate agency investigator may come to look at a transaction, not because of anything on your side, but it could be something on the other side.
Sure.
And they want to verify what was in the listing agent's file because they have an issue with what happened on the buyer's side, maybe that communication between the buyer and the buyer's agent. And if they find that, well, these things were reviewed late, and then they look at other transactions because they can, they could find that, oh, that agent consistently turned things in late, and therefore you could get a reprimand, not because of anything you did on that transaction, just because you weren't following procedures that your company set and the smaller minimum standards that the agency sets in its rules and regulations.
Right, yeah, very valid points. The other thing that I want to touch on briefly is, since we're kind of talking about forms and how that relates in, you and I both, as past chairs of the Forms Committee, have some inside perspective on how this process works. And, for those of you that have not had an opportunity to serve or be involved in your local leadership, I know both of us would really encourage you to do that and get involved. But specifically as it relates to this discussion, I think there are times where on the Forms Committee, we'll talk about the creation of a document or a form that will, in fact, through its use, become and help define the standard of care in the industry. For example, the vacant land disclosure addendum that was just created last year. I think it was a new form in 2017, this started this year. And I know that there's some controversy about that in different parts of the state, and I really don't want to get mired down in that detail of the controversy, but I will tell you that the form was created at the request of an association, and multiple people vetted it, and multiple people through discussion decided throughout the state, yes, even though we know that it is likely that this will become now a new standard of care, that when you sell a vacant land listing, you will require this of the seller, it will be delivered to a buyer, and even though it's not statutorily required for a seller to provide a disclosure statement on a piece of vacant land, we've created a document that gives them a vehicle to do that, so we're kind of imposing a standard of care on the industry. Now, I think that in those discussions, we've looked at it and said, well, is that good or is that bad? Do we want to create a standard of care that for the industry that that people may not agree with? I think the answer to that question, in my opinion, comes down to, is it good for the consumer? Is it good for the buyer of a property to know everything that there is to know about that property? Is it good for the seller to have a vehicle in which they can disclose the information that they know, that maybe ask them some questions that they wouldn't have thought about disclosing without being prompted? I think that's good. And I know that there are people who aren't going to agree with that. But there have been several forms, I think, that have been created under that same guideline. Is this good for the consumer? Is this information that the consumer should have, the purchaser of the property should have, and that the seller should be prompted to give? Another good example is the townhouse/planned community addendum that, starting in 2017, became a required document if the property was located within a planned community or a townhome. On the residential sale agreement, we added a checkbox, if it is or if it isn't, and if it is, it says use the townhome/planned community addendum. And quite honestly, I think prior to that change in the form, a lot of people were selling detached properties in planned communities and not using that. I know I was, and I'm pretty sure that was pretty common in the industry. And so we maybe have created a heightened standard of care in those transactions. But that's not bad, right? Isn't it good for your buyer, if they're purchasing a property in a planned community, to have had the opportunity to fully vet the homeowners association that they're becoming a member of and know what it means to be a member of that homeowners association? Isn't it good for you as the broker to have facilitated the transaction in which they got the opportunity to do that, as opposed to not having done that, finding out that there's a problem with the homeowners association after closing, and now your buyer is coming to you saying, you didn't even tell me that I was buying a home in an HOA. Yeah, I saw the preliminary title report, but I really didn't understand it. We didn't talk about it. I think it's a big difference if you're the broker that can say, no, we used this addendum, we filled this out together, you had the opportunity to make these requests, you had the opportunity to review these documents, you didn't receive certain documents if you didn't, and you agreed to remove the contingency anyway and proceed with the transaction. I think that that's a good standard of care. So that's just an example of this year, I think, 2 documents that were changed or created that I think have created a heightened standard of care in the industry in a positive way. Do you agree, Richard?
I do. I think that it comes down to your original point, what's best for our client. Keeping our client's interests at the forefront of our actions.
Right.
And when we can use a standardized form, it helps everyone.
Yeah, I agree. All right, so can risk ever be eliminated? And Phil has a funny comment here. He says, no, Murphy's Law, exclamation point, right? So, I just don't think there's any way to eliminate risk no matter what you do or how you do it, right? There's always risk. Certainly, I think you can minimize your risk by, as you stated, using the proper form, making sure that you understand the rules of your industry, making sure that you know what ORS 696 says, that you know what the standards of practice in the Code of Ethics say, that you understand and know the rules and regulations for your RMLS, right? That you're not just winging it, that you actually are knowledgeable about your industry and what is required of you and what you should do for your client.
And perhaps being sure that you are working with buyers and sellers in areas that you are familiar with and not going 8 counties away to a place that you've never operated before.
Yeah, absolutely. And, Phil's got here on the outline that you see on your screen, the vetting of that, clients and potential clients, right? I think it starts with your consultation meeting with your client. And I do a lot of training in the industry, as I'm sure you do as well, and I'm constantly surprised at how many people are willing to just go show a property to a client they've never met and create effectively an agency relationship by continuing to work with that person when they've never had a discussion about how they do business, whether or not this is a good fit for you and I to work together. So take away the safety component of that, which I think you expose yourself to a huge safety risk if you just go willy-nilly meeting clients at properties without knowing them. But in addition to that, you might be hooking yourself up with somebody who is a bad fit. And it doesn't matter how great of a realtor you are and how much you care about that client. If they don't value and appreciate what you're bringing to the table, you have a heightened level of risk with that person.
And prospective sellers and buyers can't choose how you want to work with them.
Right.
The other way around. So if you have a listing and a buyer comes to you and says, oh, well, I want you to represent me. Well, if that's not what you do, you get to choose. The client, that potential client doesn't choose how you're going to work with them. You choose how you need to work with them, not the other way around.
Right.
And that's a big risk issue.
Yeah, it is. It is. I mean, vetting your client up front and making sure that it's somebody who you're comfortable representing, that you feel is going to be honest and truthful with you and with the other side of the transaction. And bottom line is that there's a personality fit. Are they comfortable with how you're going to negotiate the deal, right? Are they comfortable with how you're going to help them in the transaction? And I think that's important. And like I said, I'm surprised at how many people will represent folks that they really don't know that well, or choose to represent somebody who just is not a good fit for their business. And I'm telling you, this comes back to the point that I made early on. No commission check is worth it, right? If you know you're not a fit for somebody, the best thing you can do is introduce them to another broker who's a better fit. And maybe you can get a referral agreement for that, maybe you can't. But, you won't have the headache of dealing with somebody who's not a fit for you, and you won't have the risk that's associated with it. And it's twofold. Not only is it a headache, but it is an increased risk. And then the property, right? There are certain examples of risk, certain risks specific to the property that you might represent. As we talked about already with a condominium sale or a townhome sale. Maybe the property is a fixer-upper. Maybe it's a HUD home purchase, right? And you're not as familiar with having sold a HUD home and how that transaction type goes and how those forms are. New construction, that's
country property, you work in the city, and all of a sudden there's a well and a septic, or maybe it's a spring fed for water, and are there water rights and all sorts of intricate details that are unique to those types of property.
Yeah, and I get the question all the time, right? Because, I mean, the bottom line is sellers have a right to sell the property regardless of the condition of it. Buyers have a right to buy the property regardless of the condition of it. So it isn't a matter that you would say, oh, wow, this property, is a fixer-upper. I might not list this property, or that's, just because it's going to be a difficult sale doesn't mean you're not going to do the transaction. It just means that you may have a heightened level of risk, and you may want to involve somebody who has some expertise in that area to help you co-broker that deal, or you might want to refer it to somebody until you've got the experience to be comfortable doing it. I'm not saying don't sell a HUD home. I'm just saying maybe you ought to know what you're doing and have read the forms and understand what the buyer's obligations are going to be, and you can help talk them through it. Same thing with, as you said, a rural property. It's not that you can't sell a property that's got a well or a septic, but if you've never done one, you ought to make sure you understand how they work and how that negotiation is going to go before you just put yourself right in the middle of it, right? And then there are increased risks depending upon the types of transactions. The contingent right to purchase form, as an example, we participated in creating that form and modifying that form. I think you and I did when we were on the forms committee together. I think
we argued a lot about that form, Jeff.
Yeah, I think we did. We did, and then Steve Russell and I continued the argument, but in a positive way. I think we ended up with a good product as a result. But that's an example where there is a risk to your buyer and your seller because of that transaction type. And I always start my conversation with my clients when they're doing a transaction that's contingent on if the inherent risk of you having sold your current home without closing on the home you're buying and forcing you into a situation where you might be homeless, if you aren't comfortable with that risk, then this type of transaction is not for you. But that risk cannot be mitigated. It just is an inherent risk with that type of transaction. Okay. All right, and so then Phil has a bullet point here about reactive risk management after the problem has risen. Well, that's kind of CYA at that point, right? And so, yes, good documentation in your file is important. Making sure that you've effectively communicated with all parties in the transaction, your principal, the agent on the other side, the buyers on the other side regarding anything material in the transaction, having a clear chain of documentation showing that you've communicated that, and that you've been transparent, right? I mean, for me, I kind of look at that as saying, look, I'm not saying that negative things don't happen in a transaction. I'm not saying that properties don't have issues that come up, but I'm absolutely going to be transparent about those issues. I'm absolutely going to encourage the seller to say, here's something that needs to be disclosed, and I recommend that you disclose it right away. And, honestly, if I'm looking at a seller who isn't willing to do that, I'm making a decision about whether I want to represent that person or not. But reactive risk management is not necessarily the position you want to be in, right? They always say, what's the saying? It goes, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, right? And I think that most people talk about that when it comes to maintenance of a home or a car, but I think it is absolutely applicable in risk management. If you can prevent the risk and mitigate the risk during the transaction, as we already stated, prior to closing, so much better than having to react when you've gotten a notice of arbitration or some type of a claim against you from a client or a party in the transaction who's unhappy with how it went. And then closing the loop, right? So CYA section here. Email is, your best friend or your worst enemy. It depends, I guess, on what you say in the email, right? And I look at it as documentation. If you're documenting, then that's better than not documenting, right? So I don't look at email as a negative thing. If you're summarizing a conversation and you send an email to a client saying, hey, here's just a summary of what we've discussed, I think that's a positive thing. Now, could that email be used against you at some point if you made a mistake? Sure, it could. But I think it's better off to have the email and have the documentation than to be so afraid that something you say can be used against you that you don't document it. If you're afraid that it can be used against you, then don't say it. right? I mean, you should never be giving advice that you think could be used against you. So I look at email as a friend more than an enemy. It's an opportunity for you to document your conversations and make sure that you have historical record of any advice you've given, anything you've said, any details of the negotiation, and all of that. Certainly, you can use your transactional platforms for that. I know that the transaction management platform that we have has every transaction has a unique email address where when you send an email to a client, you can send it into the transaction. I know a lot of brokers don't do that. I know that they keep their emails in a separate file or folder or whatever, and they may not upload that to the transaction file for their company. I think you should. I know I'm necessarily not compliant to that myself in certain circumstances just because I don't think about it. You know, your transaction's moving quickly, you're moving quickly, you don't think to include that email address. But the more information that your company has, and certainly you should talk with your principal broker and look at your company policy manual about their policies in regard to this. But the more information your company has, if there's a complaint that's made against you in the company, the better. Texting is the same way. You can easily create a PDF of your text stream. Most platforms nowadays will allow you to print your text message stream or save it as a PDF on your computer. I'm a Mac advocate and a Mac user, and I'll tell you, it just makes it super easy when you use iMessage or Mac texting on your MacBook. You can just save it as a PDF to your computer, the whole stream, and it just goes into your correspondence file. I like that a lot. Social media, the good, bad, the ugly. All I'm really going to say there, and I'm not going to take a lot of time on it, what you put out there, you put out there, right? And unfortunately, what I see most brokers using social media for as a platform is an opportunity to complain and be negative instead of positive. And I discourage you from using social media in that way. And I would just say, I taught a code of ethics class recently where we were having this conversation, and I would just say, if you regularly are getting on the Masters of Real Estate or whatever it's called and complaining about brokers and complaining about how this goes or that goes, there's one constant in your complaint about all of the other brokers that you're interacting with. And that one constant is you. So if you're out on the platform complaining about all of these brokers, the one constant person involved in those interactions is you. And perhaps there's some wisdom there that you might want to look in the mirror at, I guess is all I could say. But social media, you just got to know, once you put it out there, it's out there, and it's hard to take it back. Even if you can retract it, it's hard to take it back once it's been put out there. So be cautious and careful. I'm going to turn it over to you now, Richard, and let you drive and talk about your portion, which is the form specifically and buyer agent best practices.
Okay, so I think we're going to talk about a couple of things. How to prepare a seller for contingencies, things that they have to be prepared for when they get an offer. You want to start on the list side. Then the types of contingencies that exist in the sale agreements that we have, OREF sale agreements 01, 06, and 11. Then what are the kind of addenda we use with those agreements, or at the time we're making the sale, or follow-up. And then buyer agent practices. What are ways that we can work with our buyers before, during the transaction to understand those contingencies from their side and what responsibilities they have during those contingency periods. So there are several contingencies that the seller needs to be aware of. So when you are listing a property, I think a best practice is to sit down with the seller and look at those contingencies, because the contingencies that exist in the sale agreement, or the OREF 001, there's really not much that a seller has responsibility to do, but there are buyer contingencies. Is the seller aware of those and how long they take, and they are negotiable. And then and if there are septic, we're going to talk about that. What are other ways they can prepare, including understanding what the property disclosure is and what additional documentation they may have or not have. And all that needs to be done at the time you are working with them on the listing and getting the listing. We shouldn't be doing those things after it's signed, on the market, and soliciting offers. So one of the keys that I think is very important, you can call it the 4 W's, but it is who delivered what to whom and when. That really is the key to all contingencies, and it's a key to a standards of practice. So whether you're on the list side or the seller side, you know what was done, by whom, and when, what they got. So contingencies in the ORAF 01, 06, 011 sale agreement, the residential agreement, the condo resale, and the new construction. So they all three have one contingency in common. It really isn't a contingency, but it's a requirement of delivery of the preliminary title report. And it gives the buyer some time, 5 business days, if not filled in, after they receive that report to tell the seller if they have any issues, what is on the report. So when you turn your transaction in, whatever that policy is in your company, are you being sure that your client's email is being sent, is accurate, and is being sent to Title Escrow, because they're the delivery. I don't see any mailed or faxed preliminary title reports. They're all emailed, which is great, because then your client has links when they get it, so they can look at anything, whether there's easements, CC&Rs, or other things. They have direct access to that. And as part of your transaction, when was the property disclosure and the lead-based paint addendum delivered? I see some people on counteroffers, list, price, possession, other issues, other negotiated items and terms, and then add buyer acknowledges receipt of the following documents, and they list them. And so maybe it's besides the disclosure, lead-based paint if it applies, if it's target housing, or maybe there's a oil tank document, maybe it's 5 pages, 2 pages, they did a repair on the roof, because that shows from the seller side the buyer has that during the negotiation period. So it means that if the buyer has an issue with any of those things, maybe they walk away and you don't go pending and then have a sale fail 3 or 4 days later. So documenting those things as part of the transaction if you're able to do that. When you look at new construction, there's the maintenance schedule and the warranty that the builder is supposed to deliver to the buyer. So are you waiting? Are you going to get those up front? Are you going to get those at closing? You should find out. Talk to your buyer, if it's on the buyer side, when they're likely to get those, as well as those are what's in the sale agreement, but there's also some other documents depending on when the occupancy permit was provided or will be available for lien notices and other things. But all that is, you need to keep track of. And specifically for condominium docs and information. So, and this relates to HOAs. If you, in most MLSs, whether it's in the property's in an HOA, it's a yes or no, it's a requirement. So my concern is if money is involved in the HOA, $50 a year, well, they just use it to have a party on the 4th of July. Doesn't matter. You, as the listing agent, and you as the buyer's agent, aren't a member of that HOA. You can't speak for what their rules are, when they collect the money, how they collect the money, what they use it for, or what they may be planning to do with the dues from $50 to $500 a year. So don't let your helpfulness mean that you speak for something that you don't represent. So if there's money associated with an HOA, I think that the standard of practice would be to be sure that that amount is accurately represented in the property disclosure by the seller and in the MLS that you're in. And that means that if you're representing a buyer, you should be using the correct form with your sale agreement, that townhouse PUD. And that means that even if it's not a townhouse and even if it's not a PUD, that there is an HOA and they collect money, then I think that you are not following industry practice and the standard of care if you don't use the townhouse PUD addendum. If there's money collected, it's a requirement. And here's what your risk is. I talk to agents, And they tell me, well, I just tell the title company and they send the information to the buyer. Well, guess what? Bylaws often aren't recorded, and certainly the minutes aren't, and the financials aren't, and the annual meeting and the board meeting minutes aren't. None of those things are recorded. Title company may get access at the end of the transaction. You want a buyer to get all this information. How is that going to look if you represent a buyer and all of a sudden, wait a second, I could have got this already? And when you look at the form, you have to remember that there is a requirement that the seller, at seller's expense, it's in the condominium form, and it's also in the townhouse community plan community addendum. Seller agrees at seller's expense to provide buyer within 7 business days the following documents, all those check marks. That means seller at seller's expense. And the buyer's time frame, they have 5 business days if not filled in, of which to say they disapprove and end the transaction, similar to the inspection. The buyer's time period doesn't start till the seller delivers the last document, and that includes notifying the buyer of documents that aren't available, that don't exist. So do you want your seller to find out that 3 days before closing, the buyer just got the HOAs and they want to say, no, I'm not buying it? And when your seller finds out that you should have delivered, had the seller deliver those documents early on, that's not going to be a very good situation. So let's go back to who delivered what to whom and when. When it comes to HOA, condominium docs, HOA docs, there's a number of ways to provide that. We talked about the receipt addendum, which is, it's in my stack here.
059.
It's 059, receipt of report / removal of contingencies addendum. Some people don't use it because there's a space to remove contingencies. You don't have to fill out that part. Leave that part blank because it doesn't apply, but it gives you a chance to list reports and information. Some people use that to provide the access to the HOA website. If your seller allows you to, seller's permission, some sellers just say, hey, here's my username and login. I have to provide 2 years worth of annual meeting minutes. There may be 5 there. It's more information. Let the buyer have access. Sometimes you're sending PDFs. Often those PDFs aren't necessarily named because they may have been scanned or there's multiple documents in each one. So if you're going to send an email, I'm going to send it to Jeff because he's representing the buyer, the seller, or the management company has sent me the required documents, then I'm going to send them to Jeff. And in the email, I'm going to say, here are these documents. And look at my agreement and see which ones aren't there and tell him they don't have those forms. I prefer that the management company say that they don't have them, but in the absence of that, then if it's true, then I can send it, because then I know when the time period starts. And I can prove, even if it was 2 scans that had some long scan ID, I'm saying what is in there. So Jeff, when he forwards that to his buyer, knows, because delivery to the agent is delivery to the client. Right. So I want to be sure that Jeff gets it, and I want to document that. Email is a great way to do that. So if there's lots of other docs, and you can use the receipt of reports, and in fact, some people follow up with the receipt of reports because it has the date. And so even though I might email them, often an agent will follow up a day or 2 later with that and send it to the other side. And the date on there isn't the date that the person signed it, but it's the date that they were delivered, and they can even document that they were delivered via email on a certain date. That might be going a little far, but that is possible. And when you look at what you're trying to do, standard of care, that covers, at least from the list side, I've done what the seller needed to do. Provide information timely, and it's not just, oh, here, come by my office and pick them up, because that's not delivery to the person. The longer they wait, then the longer it is for delivery. So we want to be sure that we are delivering what's required and making sure we tell them what isn't available, because that is key. The time frame for the buyer doesn't start till the seller delivers every available document and says what they don't have. because that is as important. So when we look at specific addenda, we talked about the HOA addendum. Well, you know, recently we started using an on-site sewage system addendum. I think we're going to change the name to make it, but the on-site sewage system addendum has a requirement in Section 4 that the seller agrees to provide the buyer or buyer's agent with all written documentation regarding the on-site sewage system, including endless inspections, tests, things done in the last 6 months, or their maintenance agreements, which may be a DEQ requirement for sand filters, and any other material information regarding the system within 3 business days. So if you know you have an on-site sewage system and you're a listing agent, now's the time to, when you're listing it, get the seller to get what they have, or at least provide you with something in writing of what they don't have. Because sometimes that's the case. Well, you know, it's the, you know, the parents are selling, they've lived there for 35 years, they don't have anything, they don't have the map or anything. So fine, they can write that down. They can, so it isn't the agent saying, oh, Jeff, the sellers don't have anything, because I want the seller to tell me that so I can give it to you. Because then that's a fact I'm passing on. And then if the seller ends up finding something later, then it makes it look like I said there wasn't any. It's the seller. So the seller has these things, gather them up. If they don't, they should give you something so that when you do have a sale, you can pass it on. So that means that the seller has fulfilled their obligation within the time period. Sometimes the seller agrees to pay for certain inspections on here. Well, guess what? Sometimes the reports are given to the person who pays for it. So the seller or their agent needs to, in a timely way, as soon as those reports are available, deliver them. And again, it's who delivered what to when, and so and how. So you want to do that because the buyer has 10 business days after the buyer's received any documentation on the system and things. So the sooner the seller provides these things, the better the contingency is being met. Because what do agents argue about, Jeff? When the time period ended.
Right.
Right? And then managing brokers get involved, and buyers, and you know, we're trying to facilitate a sale if there can be one. So if we know when it starts, then we know when it ends.
Business days are a big discussion this year. We changed the form to include Columbus Day as a non-business day.
It's
right?
a non-business day.
Yeah.
Which also reminds us to say that Friday tomorrow is a non-business day. Because in Oregon, holidays, recognized holidays on Saturday, then it's celebrated that it's non-business day on Friday. If it's on Sunday, then it's Monday. In this case, it's Friday.
I just want to add one quick point about that. I think a best practice, and I do it as a buyer's agent, I create a timeline and summary of the transaction once we get an accepted offer. I send that to my client, and I say, here are the timelines as I read the document. I send that to the listing agent and say, here are the timelines that I've communicated to my client. Please let me know if you see anything that you think you don't agree with or that there's a discrepancy. And that way we aren't getting to the 5 p.m. on the end of the professional inspection period contingency and having an argument. We've agreed already. No, everybody understands
right.
all the time.
Right. And, you know, and Jeff and I have had the discussion about acknowledgement and delivery on sale agreements and mutual agreement. We're not going to get into that today. We have other things. We have other things to argue about in the future.
We don't have all day.
That we don't have all day. But here's something that you know, there's 2 things in the private well addendum. One is if the seller testing duties. Often the well tester will go out, they'll test everything the buyer wants, and then they'll send that portion of the $200, $300, whatever the testing service is doing, and they'll send that bill to the seller. But the seller's required in the agreement to be sure the buyer got the report. And often agents just assume, oh, well, the buyer got it because, well, did they? And we still want confirmation in the file. How did the report get delivered? and who did it deliver to, and so did the well testing company send it? I want a confirmation for my file. If I'm on the list side, I want to know when the buyer got it. Did they ever got it? My seller has a obligation to deliver that to the buyer. We need to know, because the buyers aren't always, and sometimes their agent isn't always there when the person goes to test the water. Sometimes they are, sometimes they're not. So that's a seller duty. And in Section 6, well information provided by the seller. And this part is filled out by the buyer, and the seller needs to, in a timely manner, right up front, tell the buyer in writing if they have these things and deliver them, or more importantly, that they don't.
Right.
That's because there's a time of the essence on Section 9, professional tests performed, reports, etc. And so the seller needs to be sure the buyer has this information, because that may relate to what they test for and how, or other inspections they may have. So, this is important. And when we come to the receipts of reports and removal of contingencies addendum for well information, septic information, this is ideal for that.
Yeah, I agree.
And so you want to keep that in mind. When we're working on the buyer side, what we want to do is not only forward the information, provide the information to our buyer, but we've got two other steps. One is we want to remind them when the deadline is for
Right.
them to file their objections.
Right.
And two is we want to check in with them prior to that to remind them a second time. Do you have any objections? If you don't object, that time period expires. And sometimes it may happen on an inspection, but maybe it relates to the well or just the roof or something.
Usually the prelim too.
And the prelim, but if we're sending them the buyer information, and as Jeff suggested, okay, I was there at the end of the inspection and we talked about some issues, and maybe I gave them a name of a builder or somebody at the building department or planning or somebody at the HOA. I'm going to follow that up with an email and say, hey, Jeff, yesterday we were there. I gave you the names. Don't forget, you need to call them. Here's the deadline. If you need somebody to go back to the house, we need to make an appointment so the seller and the listing agent know. But if we do nothing, then this is our deadline. So if we want to respond, then we need to have time for the seller to respond back to us if we're asking them to do something. So keep in mind the deadlines. That kind of communication, when even though you might sit down with them at their house, but you follow up with an email as a standard of care. That means that when it's 6 months or a year later and one party or the other says, hey, this information wasn't provided or I didn't know, we can go back to our emails. Hopefully those emails are in the transaction that the company has as well as yours. Then it can show what happened, who
Right.
delivered what to when. And we followed up with our client. Hey, when it comes to vacant land, the issue is people say it's buildable. Well, neither the listing agent, the seller, nor the buyer is the governing authority as to what can be built and how it can be built. So we need to remember whatever information we're providing, we're referring our clients, buyers or sellers, to the authority or to the person in that expertise, and then follow up. Hey, you said you were going to call the building department. Did you do that?
Right.
It's really up to them. If they say no, I decided to take the risk, that's fine. It doesn't matter if I agree or not. That's their choice. And if there's a problem 6 months later when they can't get permission, they had the opportunity and we gave it to them and they chose not to. That's okay.
You're being the resource and not the source.
The resource, we can be too helpful, and sometimes when we try to be all and do all, that adds to our risk.
Right.
So we want to help our client, but we need to direct them to the people that actually know about roofs and basements and wells and the governing authorities that have jurisdiction over them. So that's how we close the loop. Who delivers what to when and how.
Well, and I agree with that. You made a comment earlier about tailoring into being the resource and not the source. It's not good service to your client to proclaim expertise or to proclaim knowledge that you don't have, right? You want to be helpful. But the best way that you can be helpful is making sure that your client gets to the proper source of the information so they can evaluate their decision and how they want to move forward in the transaction. If you become the source and you're not accurate, as well-meaning as you are, you've created liability for yourself and your company, and you've not properly served your client because you didn't direct them to the source. So I think that that's an important point, too.
Okay, I think that about covers it. We're right on
Right at
time.
11:29. I can't believe that between two of us on this conference call, we were able to keep it to an hour. I don't see any questions, and so I hope that you will have all enjoyed the hour with Richard and Jeff, and that it was an entertaining discussion for you and that you learned something. And we appreciate you tuning in today and participating in the conference call, and we wish you a wonderful Thanksgiving and holiday season, right?
And don't forget to thank our veterans tomorrow. Please do so.
Absolutely. Thanks, Richard.